He laughed at Chuck Norris and called him an old man. But that night in the ring, Jake Paul realized that strength isn't about views or likes. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The lights of Los Angeles burned like molten gold across the horizon, spreading their artificial dawn long before the sun had any say in the matter. Inside a towering studio complex in West Hollywood, a young man with restless energy and a smile sharpened by fame leaned toward the microphone. Jake Paul, dressed in designer streetwear and surrounded by monitors, cameras, and a half-dozen crew members with glowing phones, grinned as if the entire world were a stage built only for him. The air inside the room was thick with the pulse of bass-heavy music and the constant chatter of social media staff calling out analytics and live numbers. Every word, every expression, every raised eyebrow was content. Every movement could be replayed, remixed, turned into a $1 million clip. He adjusted his headset, glancing at the scrolling comments on his live stream. Tens of thousands of people were already tuned in, emojis and capital letters flooding the chat like a digital tide. Jake's eyes gleamed. This was his arena. Not a boxing ring, not a dojo, but the glowing square of the internet, where attention was the only currency that mattered. "All right, chat," he said, flashing his signature smirk. "You all keep saying I should fight another real legend, right? A name from the past. Somebody from your dad's movie collection?" Laughter rippled through the studio. The camera zoomed closer. "So here's what I'm thinking. How about Chuck Norris?" The room erupted. His producer slapped the table. One of the camera operators nearly dropped his rig laughing. Jake leaned back, the grin widening. "Yeah, I said it. The beard, the roundhouse kicks, the memes, the old man himself. Let's see if the myth still works outside the VHS tapes." The chat exploded with fire emojis in disbelief. Some begged him to do it. Others accused him of blasphemy. Jake thrived on both. The louder the reaction, the stronger the validation. "I mean, come on," he continued. "Guys, what? Pushing 80? I'll respect the beard, but let's be real. This isn't the 80s anymore. This is YouTube, baby. This is my time." He stood up suddenly, punching at the air in mock karate poses, his entourage howling with laughter. One of his editors quickly loaded a montage onto the massive LED screen behind him. Clips of Chuck Norris from old action movies intercut with memes and jokes. Chuck fighting bad guys, Chuck punching through walls, Chuck smiling serenely as explosions went off behind him. Then Jake appeared, green-screened into the footage, pretending to knock the legend out with a single punch. The crowd inside the studio howled. "You see that?" he said, laughing. "That's what's coming, Grandpa. Don't take it personally. I'm just upgrading the franchise." The clip went viral before the show even ended. Within hours, Russian Jake vs. Chuck trended across multiple platforms. Millions of people debated whether Jake had gone too far, whether the legendary martial artist would respond, whether the internet's cockiest showman had finally picked a fight with someone who didn't need Wi-Fi to be famous. Jake loved it. Controversy was oxygen. By nightfall, he was back on camera, posting videos titled "Why I'll End Chuck Norris in One Round." The thumbnails screamed confidence, but beneath them there was something else. The thrill of taunting a ghost, of challenging a myth. Far away in a quiet corner of Texas, a different kind of light filled a modest dojo built of weathered wood and discipline. The dawn was still shy, spreading faint streaks of gray across the horizon. Inside, Chuck Norris stood barefoot on the worn tatami mats, his breath slow and steady. The air smelled faintly of cedar and sweat. He moved through a slow kata, his motions precise, controlled, ageless. Every movement had purpose, each transition balanced between effort and ease. When he finished, he bowed slightly to the empty room. Only then did he pick up a towel and wipe his face. The dojo was silent except for the soft hum of morning insects beyond the open window. His brother Aaron stepped inside, holding a mug of coffee. "You seen what's blowing up online?" he asked, half smiling, half wincing. Chuck didn't answer right away. He took the mug, nodded his thanks, and sat down on the low wooden bench near the wall. Aaron placed a tablet beside him and tapped play. The sound of Jake's voice filled the room, loud, mocking, confident. The montage replayed, the laughter, the taunts, the promise to retire the legend. Chuck listened in complete stillness, eyes unreadable. The clip ended with Jake pointing at the camera. "Come on, Chuck. Show the world if the myth still breathes." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then Chuck set the tablet down beside him. "He's a kid," he said quietly. "A loud one, but still a kid." Aaron chuckled softly. "He's got half the world watching him, the other half probably waiting to see you shut him up." Chuck smiled faintly. Shutting people up never taught them anything. He stood, gazing toward the open window, where the early light now touched the floorboards. "Every generation needs a reminder," he said. "Strength without respect is just noise." Aaron frowned. "You thinking about answering him?" Chuck took another slow breath. "I'm not thinking about it," he said. "I already have." He walked to the small wooden cabinet in the corner, opened it, and retrieved an old black belt, frayed and faded from years of use. He ran his fingers along the rough edges, feeling the history woven into its fabric. "There was a time," he murmured, "when people trained for peace. Now they train for followers." He tied the belt around his waist with the deliberate precision of a man sealing a promise. Maybe it's time someone reminded them what fighting was meant to be. News of his acceptance spread within hours. A brief statement, delivered without press agents or hashtags. Chuck Norris accepts Jake Paul's challenge. For charity, for discipline, for respect. No emojis, no catchphrases. Just a sentence. The simplicity made it more powerful than any advertisement. Sports networks picked it up, talk shows debated it, and Jake's team rejoiced at the tidal wave of attention. To them, it was perfect marketing, the young face of modern entertainment versus the stoic legend of another era. They couldn't see the deeper thread that had begun to form, that beneath the glitz and sarcasm, something ancient and necessary was stirring. In the days that followed, the contrast between them became a media obsession. Jake's camp leaked rehearsal videos of him training with celebrity coaches, punching heavy bags while his team shouted encouragement. Every frame was lit, edited, monetized. He posed for photos, his gloves inscribed with sponsors' logos, his smile as practiced as his punches. The press loved him, the arrogance, the youth, the sound bites. He was every headline's dream, the influencer versus the icon. Meanwhile, Chuck disappeared from the spotlight. There were no interviews, no leaked footage. Only a few photos surfaced of him walking alone along a dusty ranch road, his hands wrapped in tape, his expression calm. When reporters tried to reach him, his assistant simply said, "Mr. Norris is preparing." The lack of spectacle only deepened the mystery. The public began to split in opinion, some mocking him as outdated, others sensing that something more meaningful was taking shape. In comment sections and forums, quiet voices began to push back against the noise. "Respect doesn't age," one post read. It went viral not for its wit, but for its truth. Jake, however, had no patience for subtlety. Every new video he uploaded was louder, slicker, more provocative. He posted mock training clips where he punched cardboard cutouts of Chuck, bragged about his youth, and promised to end nostalgia. His confidence fed on outrage. "You know what I'm doing," he shouted into one stream, pacing in front of a massive banner that read, "Legends Fall Too." "I'm ending the myth. I'm showing every kid watching that you don't have to bow to the past. You just have to take it down." The crowd of online followers erupted in virtual applause. That night, Chuck sat on his porch, watching the wind ripple through the fields. The sky above Texas was deep and endless, filled with quiet stars. He could hear the faint hum of crickets, the soft groan of the wooden boards beneath his chair. On the table beside him lay an old photograph, himself at 28, standing beside his sensei in Okinawa. The memory carried him back to the words that had shaped his life. Respect is not fear of power. It is recognition of its weight. He closed his eyes for a moment, and the noise of the modern world fell away. When he opened them again, his decision was firm. The challenge wasn't about proving anything to Jake Paul. It was about proving something to everyone watching. That age, humility, and patience were not relics. They were roots. And even in a digital age built on noise, roots could still crack concrete. In the days that followed, the announcement became a global phenomenon. Late-night hosts joked about it. Sports pundits analyzed every angle. Was it real? Was it staged? Could an 80-year-old man really fight one of the most controversial young boxers in the world? Every question added more fuel. Yet through all the noise, Chuck remained silent. His stillness became its own kind of storm. Aaron watched from the doorway one morning as Chuck finished another brutal training session. The sound of his bare fists striking the heavy bag echoed through the dojo. When it was over, Chuck knelt briefly, resting his hands on his knees. "You really think it's worth it?" Aaron asked quietly. "You could walk away. You've got nothing to prove." Chuck smiled, faint and calm. "That's exactly why I have to do it," he said. He thinks respect is a relic. Maybe it's time the relic showed him what endurance looks like. By the end of the week, the date was set. Las Vegas, the city of spectacle, where lights and legends intertwined. The promotional posters displayed Jake's grin beside Chuck's steady gaze. Youth against age, swagger against stillness. The tagline read, "Old school meets new blood." For Jake, it was the ultimate stage. For Chuck, it was the final dojo. One last place to demonstrate that fighting had never been about destruction, but about control. The internet had chosen its sides. Betting sites favored Jake by an impossible margin. Commentators laughed about ancient bones and nostalgia knockouts. Jake basked in it, giving interviews full of sound bites and bravado. "This isn't a movie," he said during one press junket. "This is real life, and real life always moves forward." Somewhere far from the cameras, Chuck heard the line and smiled faintly. "Real life always moves forward," he repeated to himself. But truth never leaves. As the lights of Los Angeles flickered into the desert night, both men prepared in their own ways. One with cameras, one with silence. Across generations, across worlds, their paths were set on a collision course neither could yet fully understand. For Jake, it was a fight for relevance. For Chuck, it was something deeper, something older. A lesson waiting to be taught in the only language that never grows obsolete. And when the desert wind rose that night, sweeping through the empty Texas fields, it carried with it the faint whisper of an old truth returning to life. The louder the world becomes, the more powerful silence can be. The contrast between them grew sharper with every passing day. Jake Paul's world roared with lights, cameras, and laughter, while Chuck Norris's world hummed in stillness, defined by the rhythm of breath and the whisper of wind through the desert. What began as a joke had turned into a global event. The date was set, the contract signed, and the machine of hype had begun to move with merciless speed. Yet for all the noise that thundered from Jake's side of the spectacle, somewhere beyond it all, in the quiet emptiness of Texas, something deeper and older was awakening. Something that could not be filmed or monetized. In Los Angeles, Jake's training camp looked more like a film set than a gym. Neon lights flashed from the corners of the room, cameras followed his every movement, and assistants whispered updates about followers, sponsorships, and pre-fight ticket sales. The smell of energy drinks filled the air, mingling with cologne and ambition. Every workout was streamed, every punch performed for an audience that demanded not progress but entertainment. Jake's gloves were custom-made, gold-stitched with his logo, his shorts lined with the names of sponsors who had paid handsomely to appear in his corner. "Keep your shoulders higher, Jake," his trainer shouted, circling him. "Remember, it's not just about the fight, it's about the clip." Jake smirked, his punches cutting through the air like thunderclaps. "Yeah," he said, "I'm not training for a belt, I'm training for the algorithm." He believed it too. To him, this wasn't a test of skill or legacy, it was performance art. Every drop of sweat was content, every insult toward his opponent another headline. The camera operators shifted angles, catching him mid-punch with perfect lighting, while his team shouted and laughed. When the session ended, Jake grabbed a towel and turned to one of his vlog cameras. "Let's go again tomorrow," he said breathlessly, his grin still wide. "Chuck's probably meditating somewhere, but I'm out here creating views." His followers flooded the chat with laughing emojis and praise. He felt unstoppable. This was his century, his language, his domain. But in Texas, far from the hum of machines, the same sun rose over silence. Chuck Norris stood barefoot on the sand outside his small dojo. wrapped hands resting loosely at his sides. The desert stretched endlessly before him, a vast and patient audience of dust and light. He began his morning ritual at dawn, moving through katas with deliberate precision. His motions were calm, yet filled with invisible weight. Each strike measured, each breath controlled. The sound of his fists cutting through the air blended with the low murmur of the wind. Sweat gathered on his forehead, glistening briefly before evaporating in the dry heat. When the last movement was done, he knelt in quiet meditation, eyes half closed, body perfectly still. The memories of his early years returned, the smell of old dojos, the stern voice of his master, the endless repetition that had shaped him into more than a fighter. His life had never been about competition. It had been about understanding where power came from and what it cost to use it. To him, this fight with Jake was not about proving superiority, but about demonstrating what the young man had forgotten, that true mastery was invisible until it was needed. Aaron watched from the doorway, leaning against the wooden frame. "You know," he said softly, "the whole world's expecting a circus. They're selling t-shirts already. Half the internet thinks you won't even show up." Chuck opened his eyes and looked at him, expression unreadable. "Then half the internet's about to learn something," he said simply. "You really think he's worth your time?" Aaron asked. Chuck stood, brushing dust from his knees. "It's not about him. It's about the people watching him. They've forgotten what respect looks like." Back in Los Angeles, Jake's team brainstormed new ways to keep the momentum going. A promotional shoot was scheduled, a stage face-off against a stand-in actor made to resemble Chuck. Jake arrived late, wearing mirrored sunglasses and grinning for the paparazzi. "All right, let's make this viral," he said, slipping on his gloves. They filmed him throwing mock punches at the stand-in, shouting exaggerated insults. "Come on, Grandpa, where's that roundhouse kick?" He kicked at the air, sending the crowd into hysterics. When the cameras stopped rolling, he turned to his assistant. "Upload that in 10 minutes, he said. "Caption it, 'Legends are just old stories.'" Within hours, it had 10 million views. Jake thrived in the glow of it. Reporters crowded him with microphones, asking if he was worried about facing someone who had once been the embodiment of martial discipline. "Look," he said, leaning casually against a luxury car, "I respect what he did in his time. But let's be real, this is a new era. I'm faster, stronger, hungrier. He's a brand from a different generation, and I'm about to rebrand him for this one." Laughter erupted around him. The cameras loved him. The headlines loved him. And Jake mistook that love for truth. In Texas, Chuck didn't watch the interviews. Aaron sometimes mentioned them, but Chuck would simply shake his head and continue training. He focused on silence, the sound of his own breathing, the weight of stillness between movements. Each day he trained longer, harder, not out of vanity, but out of ritual. He chopped wood, ran trails, and sparred with younger students who came to his ranch for guidance. "What are you going to do when you face him?" one of them asked one morning, sweat pouring down his face after a sparring session. Chuck smiled faintly. "The same thing I've done all my life," he said. "Stay calm. Listen. Wait." The student frowned. "Wait for what?" Chuck looked out toward the desert horizon. For him to realize what the fight is really about. The world, meanwhile, couldn't stop talking about it. Sports channels dissected every possible angle, comparing Jake's youthful aggression to Chuck's timeless control. Analysts argued about physics, muscle density, and reflex speed. But beneath the statistics, a different conversation began to form about arrogance and discipline, fame and humility. Old martial artists posted videos about respect. Veterans spoke of honor. And slowly, even some of Jake's followers began to question what they were cheering for. Jake ignored it all. He lived inside a digital storm where everything validated his importance. When one of his assistants mentioned that Chuck hadn't posted a single response, Jake laughed. "That's because he doesn't have one," he said. "He's hiding behind nostalgia. The quiet thing? That's just him not knowing what to say." But that night, when the cameras were off and the studio was empty, Jake found himself scrolling through clips of old fights, grainy footage of Chuck in his prime. The movements were simple, almost slow, but there was something unsettling about them. There was no wasted energy, no visible aggression, just precision. He watched for several minutes before shutting the tablet and shaking his head. "Doesn't matter," he muttered. That was then. The following morning, Chuck stood outside as the first light broke over the plains. Aaron brought him a thermos of coffee and a folded newspaper with Jake's latest quote printed in bold. "I'm not fighting a man, I'm fighting a memory." Chuck read it, then folded the paper and handed it back. "He's right about that part," he said. "He just doesn't know whose memory it will be." Aaron frowned. "You sure you're ready for this circus?" Chuck's eyes softened. "A lion doesn't fear noise," he said. "It listens to it. It learns where the chaos is." Meanwhile, Jake's camp was a different kind of battlefield. Marketing agents, promoters, and investors filled every corner of the training facility. The smell of sweat was mixed with perfume and ambition. Every morning began with a new idea for hype, another stunt, another clip, another way to dominate the internet. Jake agreed to most of them. His confidence had grown into something hard and brittle. He had no idea that beneath the surface, the noise he fed on was beginning to hollow him out. Late one night, sitting alone in the gym after everyone had left, he found himself staring at his reflection in the mirror. For the first time, the grin didn't come easily. He threw a few lazy punches, but his timing felt off. His hands trembled slightly. He told himself it was exhaustion, not doubt. He couldn't afford doubt. Chuck, in contrast, had no mirror. His dojo walls were bare, his reflection visible only in the window when the sun rose. To him, the fight had already begun. Not with Jake, but with himself. Every movement he practiced was preparation for control, not destruction. When Aaron entered one afternoon and found him sitting cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed, he hesitated to speak. "You've been at it for hours," he said. "You're not 20 anymore, you know." Chuck smiled without opening his eyes. "Exactly," he replied. "That's why I have to be twice as patient." The promotional world spun faster as the fight approached. Commercials, interviews, countdowns. Jake's face was everywhere, on billboards, on magazine covers, on streaming ads. His tagline was simple: the new era of power. When a journalist asked if he thought he was being disrespectful to an elder, Jake smirked and said, "Respect's something you earn in the ring. Let's see if he can still earn it." It made a perfect headline. The clip went viral, but somewhere beneath the arrogance, a flicker of unease had started to form. He wouldn't admit it, not even to himself. But every time Chuck's calm eyes appeared in promotional footage, Jake felt something unfamiliar. Something like anticipation tinged with fear. On the last night before the press conference, Jake couldn't sleep. He wandered through the empty hall of his mansion. Lights dimmed, the silence heavy. For the first time, he realized he didn't like silence. It felt like the absence of applause. He poured himself a drink, opened his phone, and watched his own clips himself, laughing, shouting, winning. The joy felt distant now, mechanical. He switched to an old documentary someone had edited about Chuck's early days. There was no music, no dramatic narration, just Chuck talking about control, about breath, about knowing when not to strike. Jake watched for 10 minutes before turning it off. He didn't understand why it unsettled him. At that same hour, Chuck sat under the stars outside his dojo. Aaron was asleep. The desert was a sea of shadows and soft winds. He thought about the coming days, the noise he would have to step into, and the lesson he needed to deliver, not with anger, but with example. He wasn't angry at Jake. He pitied him a little, perhaps. Fame had its own kind of cage. He remembered a saying from his youth: "The loudest man in the room is the one who fears silence the most." He whispered it to the night and let it drift away with the wind. By morning, both men were awake before dawn. In Los Angeles, the cameras turned on to capture Jake's shadowboxing beneath a neon sign that read, "The future of fighting." In Texas, Chuck tied his old black belt, the fabric worn smooth by decades of discipline. As he stepped into the still air, he whispered the words that would guide him through everything that lay ahead. Be calm. Be present. Let the storm exhaust itself. The world would soon collide with itself, the loud and the quiet, the digital and the timeless. Jake's army of cameras and Chuck's single heartbeat would meet on equal ground. And though neither man knew it yet, this wasn't just a fight for a title or reputation. It was a confrontation between two philosophies of life, born in different centuries, destined to test each other beneath the blinding lights of a world that had forgotten what silence could do. The lights of Los Angeles were brighter than ever, shimmering across the glass towers and the endless traffic below. It was the night before the official press conference, and the city was preparing itself for the spectacle. Every billboard, every online banner, every streaming platform showed the same thing. Jake Paul, grinning confidently beside the calm, motionless image of Chuck Norris. One man was surrounded by flames and noise. The other stood in silence, his face like weathered stone. It was a visual contrast that sold millions of tickets before the first word had even been spoken. Jake had spent the entire morning in makeup and fittings for his entrance. The studio that hosted the press conference was designed like an arena, with a massive LED screen flashing slogans, music booming through hidden speakers, and hundreds of reporters, influencers, and live streamers packed shoulder to shoulder. Every person there was ready for chaos, ready to record history, or at least something that looked like it. Jake moved through the backstage corridor with the swagger of a movie star, throwing air punches and joking with his entourage. "Tonight," he said, checking his reflection in a mirror, "we go global. I'm not fighting a man, I'm fighting nostalgia, and I'm gonna win by knockout." His assistant laughed and handed him a mic pack. "Just don't trip over your ego on the way to the stage," the guy joked. Jake smirked. "That's impossible, my ego's bulletproof." He stepped out to thunderous applause. The crowd screamed, phones lifted, lights flashing like a storm. The stage was decorated with banners. The showdown, Paul versus Norris. Jake took the microphone and stood behind the podium, soaking in the energy like a performer on opening night. He waited for the cheers to die down, then looked directly into the cameras. "You know," he began, his tone cocky and easy, "when I was a kid, my dad showed me these old action movies. Chuck Norris kicking bad guys, blowing up trucks, saving the world one slow-motion scene at a time. I loved them. But then I grew up and realized they were just movies. My world's real." He paused for effect, scanning the room. "So when I step into that ring, it won't be a film set. There'll be no stunt doubles, just me and the myth, and I plan to retire that myth for good." The crowd roared, flashbulbs exploded. Jake leaned forward, grinning. "Don't get me wrong, I respect what the man did back in his day, but this isn't the 70s anymore. This isn't the age of film heroes. It's the age of real ones, the ones who bleed, sweat, and stream. I'm the future. He's the rerun." The laughter that followed was exactly what he wanted. He turned toward the large projection behind him, where his team played an edited highlight reel mocking old Chuck Norris scenes. In one clip, Jake's face was digitally inserted over a villain's, punching Chuck in slow motion to the beat of dance music. In another, Chuck was shown delivering one of his iconic kicks, only for Jake to catch it and throw him into space. The crowd howled. Jake took a sip of water, pretending to look serious for a moment. "Look, I don't mean any disrespect," he said, eyes glittering with mischief, "but legends only exist until someone new comes along, and that someone's standing right here. The internet made me, not Hollywood. And when I'm done, people will say I ended the legend that memes built." He raised a fist, cameras zoomed in, and chants of "Jake! Jake! Jake!" echoed through the hall. It was everything he had planned: chaos, laughter, and dominance. The lights dimmed for a moment, and the host announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the man himself, Chuck Norris." There was a pause. A strange, almost hesitant silence spread through the audience. Then from the far side of the stage, Chuck appeared, not surrounded by dancers, not preceded by flashing lights, but simply walking at an even pace. He wore a plain black gi, his belt tied neatly, his posture straight. There was no music, no entourage, just the sound of his steps against the floor. He looked out over the crowd, his face unreadable, and walked to the empty chair beside Jake's. The contrast was electric. Jake's side of the stage glowed with color. Chuck's side seemed carved from shadow. Reporters shuffled in their seats, unsure whether to clap or stay quiet. Some did both. The host tried to fill the silence with words, but Chuck's presence made them unnecessary. He sat down, folded his hands on the table, and looked at Jake, not with anger or challenge, but with something Jake couldn't place. something steady. When the host turned to Chuck with a question, something light, something meant to provoke headlines, he answered with calm simplicity. "I came here to fight, not to talk," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried effortlessly through the room. The audience leaned closer. The host smiled nervously. "Well, Jake here has made quite a few remarks." Chuck interrupted, not harshly, but firmly. "Words are easy. Fighting isn't." Jake laughed into his microphone. "That's cute," he said. "You practiced that line on your porch?" Chuck turned his head slightly, his gaze steady. "No, I learned it the hard way." The laughter died down faster than Jake expected. The host, sensing tension, tried to move things along. "Jake, any response?" Jake leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, trying to recover the energy. "Yeah, I've got one. You say words are easy? Maybe for you. I make mine count. You're from a time when people bought tickets to watch someone pretend to be tough. I'm from a time when we live stream it. So maybe sit this one out, old man, before you get hurt for real." A murmur ran through the crowd. Chuck didn't move. He just looked at Jake, his expression unchanged. "Pain is temporary," he said quietly, "but shame lasts longer." Jake blinked, caught off guard. "You trying to scare me?" he said, forcing a laugh. Chuck shook his head. "You can't scare someone who doesn't understand what fear means. You can only teach them." Something shifted in the room. Even those who came for entertainment felt it. A weight, a stillness, like the space between thunder and lightning. Jake opened his mouth, but no words came. The silence pressed on him, unnatural in a world that fed on noise. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the moment. Chuck's eyes stayed on him, calm, unwavering. Finally, Jake broke the silence with a forced smirk. "You sound like a fortune cookie." Laughter erupted again, but it was thinner now, unsure. Chuck nodded slightly. "Wisdom sounds like that to those who haven't learned it yet." The host quickly intervened, sensing the shift. "All right, gentlemen, let's keep it professional." But professionalism had nothing to do with what was happening. It wasn't a press conference anymore. It was something older, something primal, a test of composure between two very different men. Reporters began throwing questions. Jake answered most of them with jokes and bravado. Chuck answered few, and when he did, his responses were short, deliberate, and somehow heavier than all of Jake's noise combined. When someone asked him why he had accepted the fight, he said, "Because every storm needs silence to measure itself against." Jake rolled his eyes, pretending to yawn. "Man, do you rehearse these lines, or do they just come naturally?" Chuck didn't blink. "I stopped rehearsing when I learned to mean what I say." By the time the conference ended, Jake had dominated the headlines, but not the moment. Social media would spin his jokes into memes and sound bites, but those who were in the room would remember something else. The way the air changed when Chuck spoke. The way noise seemed to shrink in his presence. After the cameras were off, Jake turned to his manager, pretending not to care. "He's got good lines," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Old school drama. But this is my show." His manager nodded, though his expression was uneasy. "You sure you want to keep poking him like that? He's not playing your game." Jake laughed. "Then he's already lost. Everyone plays my game." Across the hall, Chuck left through a side exit, refusing interviews. Outside, the air was cool, the night stretching wide over the city. Aaron was waiting near the car. "You handled that better than I would have," he said. Chuck smiled faintly. "He's young. He thinks noise is strength." "And you?" Aaron asked. Chuck looked up at the neon glow reflecting off the clouds. "I think silence is louder than he realizes." Back inside the studio, Jake scrolled through his phone, watching clips from the event already flooding social media. His face was everywhere, his jokes replayed 1,000 times over. Yet something in the footage unsettled him. The moments when he wasn't speaking, when Chuck's eyes met his and he had nothing to say. The silence in those frames felt heavier than the laughter. He shook it off, telling himself it was nothing. Just good acting from an old man. Still, as he left the studio that night, a strange thought followed him into the dark. What if it wasn't acting at all? By midnight, both men were miles apart. Jake was surrounded by lights, his house filled with music, friends, and celebration. Chuck was back in his dojo, kneeling before the empty mat, hands folded in prayer. In one world, noise. In the other, stillness. Yet both men, for different reasons, found sleep slow to come. For one, it was restlessness. For the other, it was the quiet before the storm. The desert wind had turned cool by the time the limousines began to arrive at the arena. The city of Las Vegas pulsed with its usual rhythm of neon and noise. But tonight it felt different, charged, almost electric. Billboards flashed Jake's face in gold and silver, his grin bright against the dark skyline, while Chuck's image appeared beside him, quiet and motionless. The kind of stillness that drew more attention than movement. Across the city, people filled bars, living rooms, and theaters to watch the spectacle. It was no longer just a fight. It had become a clash of philosophies, a generational storm that everyone wanted to witness. Jake arrived first, stepping out of a black SUV surrounded by flashing cameras and the endless hum of the crowd. He wore a robe embroidered with his logo, metallic gold under the stadium lights. His entourage cheered, their voices rising over the bass that thundered from the speakers inside. "Let's make history," Jake shouted to them, and they echoed the words back as if they were a battle cry. For him, this was a coronation, a celebration of youth, fame, and the endless reach of the modern world. He waved to fans, kissed his gloves, and shouted into a camera, "Time to end the legend. Welcome to the new era." Inside the locker room, the noise didn't stop. Cameras rolled as he laced his gloves, his team shouting encouragement, pumping him up with affirmations and energy drinks. He laughed, flexed for the cameras, and shadow boxed in front of the mirror. "I was born ready," he told a reporter who dared to ask if he felt pressure. "I've fought bigger things than an old man. I fought the internet, and I won." The room erupted with applause. It didn't matter if the applause was rehearsed. It was loud, and loudness was victory in Jake's world. Across the arena, on the opposite side of the hall, Chuck Norris arrived quietly. There was no entourage, no cameras waiting at the door. Only a few event staff noticed when the car pulled up. He stepped out in his training gi, black belt tied neatly, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. The cool desert air brushed against his face, and for a moment he paused, looking up at the night sky above the flashing lights. Inside the arena, the noise was already building, but out here, the world was still calm. He breathed in slowly, the faint smell of sand and wind grounding him. His locker room was nearly empty. Just his brother Aaron, a medic, and one old student who had begged to be there. The air smelled of sweat and wood polish, not perfume and cameras. Chuck sat down on a folding chair, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Aaron leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching him tape his wrists. "You sure you want to go through with this?" he asked, not for the first time. "He's half your age, twice your speed, and the whole world's expecting a spectacle." Chuck smiled faintly. "Then I won't give them one." Aaron frowned. "What does that mean?" Chuck tightened the tape and looked up at him. "It means I'm not here to play his game." When the announcer's voice boomed through the loudspeakers, the crowd erupted. The entire arena was a living machine of sound and light. Lasers cut through the air, cameras hovered like insects, and screens the size of houses projected Jake's face in slow motion, his smile frozen in arrogance. The announcer called his name, and the crowd went wild. Jake appeared under a cascade of golden sparks, dancing to the rhythm of pounding bass, his gloves raised high. He shouted into the microphone handed to him by his team, "This is it. Tonight we bury the past and build the future." The roar was deafening. Fans waved banners, celebrities shouted his name, influencers live-streamed every second. Jake played to them, moving like a performer, every gesture measured for maximum effect. He shadowboxed, winked at the cameras, and pointed toward the tunnel where his opponent would appear. "Where's Grandpa?" he shouted. "Somebody wake him up!" The laughter that followed rolled through the stands like thunder, and then the music stopped. The lights dimmed to a single beam that cut through the center of the arena. No fireworks, no pyrotechnics, no song, just silence. From the far end of the tunnel, Chuck Norris walked into the light. The camera operators adjusted their focus instinctively, as if something about the way he moved demanded precision. His face was calm, his steps steady. He wasn't smiling, but there was no anger either, only focus. Every motion carried purpose, every step measured in time and patience. The crowd fell silent, not out of respect, but confusion. They didn't know what to make of him. In a world that thrived on volume, his silence was disarming. Even Jake paused, his grin faltering for a heartbeat before he recovered. "Took you long enough?" he called out, laughing. "I was about to warm up with your movies." Chuck looked at him, then bowed slightly. No words, no reaction. The crowd murmured, unsure whether it was mockery or humility. The referee brought them to the center of the ring. Cameras zoomed in close enough to catch the smallest twitch of expression. Jake's gloves gleamed under the lights, his body coiled with nervous energy. Chuck stood still, eyes steady on his opponent. The referee recited the rules, but neither man was really listening. When he finished, he looked at them both. "Touch gloves," he said. Jake extended his hand mockingly, tapping Chuck's glove with exaggerated flair. "Good luck, old man," he said. "Try not to break a hip." Chuck met his gaze for the first time that night and replied softly, "Luck is for gamblers." The referee stepped back. The bell rang. For the first few seconds, Jake charged forward, swinging wide and fast, testing his opponent. The crowd roared at every move, every flurry of motion. Chuck didn't react. He stepped aside, blocking lightly, letting Jake's energy burn. Jake shouted over the noise, "Come on, show me the legend." His fists cut through the air again, hitting nothing but space. Chuck's movements were so economical that they seemed slow until you realized Jake wasn't landing a single hit. The first round became a dance, youth chasing patience, fury chasing stillness. By the end of the round, Jake's breathing was already faster. Chuck's wasn't. He hadn't thrown a punch yet. When the bell sounded, Jake walked back to his corner, smirking for the cameras, pretending to be in control. "He's scared," he told his trainer. "He's too old to fight back." But his trainer frowned. "He's not scared. He's waiting." Jake laughed it off, but the words stuck. In Chuck's corner, Aaron handed him a towel. "You didn't hit him once," he said quietly. Chuck took a sip of water and smiled. "Not yet." Round 2 began with the same rhythm. Jake came in faster, trying to overwhelm the older man. This time, Chuck moved just enough sidestepping, parrying, never wasting a motion. Every breath was measured. The crowd, which had started restless, began to notice something. Jake was sweating harder now. His swings were wider, less focused. The man who had controlled every camera in the world suddenly couldn't control the air around him. At one point, Jake shouted, "Fight me, damn it!" and lunged forward with all his weight. Chuck stepped aside, pivoted, and lightly touched Jake's shoulder with an open palm. The contact looked harmless. Barely a tap, but Jake's own momentum sent him stumbling off balance. The crowd gasped, some even laughing, unsure if it was a trick or real. Jake recovered quickly, his face red with anger. "You think that's funny?" he shouted. Chuck didn't answer. He simply raised his hands again, calm and ready. When the round ended, Jake slammed his fists against the ropes, yelling at his team to stop filming him while he adjusted his gloves. For the first time, he wasn't sure how to perform confidence. He looked across the ring and saw Chuck sitting in his corner, eyes closed, breathing slow and steady. No theatrics, no posing, just composure. The crowd sensed the shift. The energy of mockery began to fade, replaced by something closer to curiosity. They wanted to see what would happen if Jake's noise finally ran out. Outside the ring, commentators whispered into microphones, struggling to define what they were seeing. "It's strange," one said. "Norris isn't fighting to win points. He's fighting to teach something." The other commentator laughed nervously. Maybe the kid's too proud to realize he's already losing. When the bell rang for the next round, Jake stood in the center of the ring, fists raised. He didn't shout this time. His breathing was heavy, his smile forced. The noise of the crowd faded into a blur. He was beginning to feel something unfamiliar, doubt. And across from him, Chuck Norris stood exactly as he had at the start. Quiet as stone, the calm eye at the center of a storm. The night had begun with spectacle, lights, and mockery. Now the arena itself seemed to hold its breath. Two men faced each other, one trembling with the need to prove himself, the other steady with the understanding that he never had to. The next few minutes would decide not who was stronger, but who understood strength. And somewhere deep inside, even Jake felt it. The noise that had built his world was beginning to tremble in the presence of silence. The bell echoed across the arena like the toll of a distant bell tower, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the air and settle into every heart that heard it. Jake stood at the center of the ring, breathing hard, sweat gleaming under the relentless light. The cheers of the crowd had softened, not from fatigue, but from tension. Something had changed. Even those who came to laugh, to mock, to record chaos for their feeds, felt it. The energy that had once belonged entirely to Jake now hovered somewhere between him and the man across the ring. Chuck Norris hadn't spoken a word, hadn't thrown a single dramatic punch, yet somehow the balance of the night had shifted toward him. Jake's chest rose and fell rapidly. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, could feel the slight tremor in his legs. Across from him, Chuck moved with deliberate calm, his steps measured, his breath invisible. There was no sound of effort from him, no sign of age, no hint of doubt. Jake tried to convince himself it was just an act, a psychological game. "He's bluffing," he muttered to himself. "He's just waiting for me to get bored." But deep down, a quieter voice whispered that, maybe, just maybe, the old man was in control of something Jake didn't understand. The referee called them forward again. "Round 3, he said. "Fight." The bell rang once more, sharp and final. Jake exploded forward, every muscle coiled with aggression. The cheers reignited, cameras flashing as he unleashed a flurry of punches designed to overwhelm, to crush, to humiliate. He could feel the heat of the crowd behind him, that familiar surge of power that came from being watched, adored, expected to win. His fists cut through the air, 1, 2, 3, 4, each with the force of his youth and pride behind them. But each strike hit nothing but emptiness. Chuck's movement was minimal. He didn't dodge with drama or retreat with panic. He simply shifted, turned, let Jake's energy pass through the space he had just occupied. It was like watching water flow around a rock. Every punch that missed seemed to sap a bit of Jake's strength, a bit of his rhythm. The sound of his gloves slicing the air grew louder, his breathing harsher. He cursed under his breath. "Stand still," he shouted, swinging wider, faster. "Stop running." Chuck did not reply. His silence infuriated Jake more than any insult could have. He threw a right hook with all his power, but Chuck caught his wrist mid-swing, twisting just enough to redirect the force, and in a single fluid motion, tapped Jake's chest with an open palm. The contact was gentle, almost harmless, but Jake stumbled back 2 steps, his balance broken by precision, not power. The audience gasped. It wasn't a knockout, not even close, but the effect was undeniable. Jake's fury collided with confusion. "What the hell was that?" he snapped. Chuck finally spoke, his voice calm and level. "That was control." The crowd went quiet, leaning forward. Jake sneered, wiping sweat from his brow. "You call that fighting? You scared to hit me for real?" Chuck tilted his head slightly. "You're already hitting yourself. You just don't see it yet." Jake lunged again, rage taking the place of strategy. His punches came harder, sloppier. The rhythm of boxing was gone, replaced by raw emotion. Each swing burned more energy than the last, while Chuck remained steady, breathing through his nose, his steps like clockwork. He countered not with violence but with patience. Small deflections, subtle shifts, the art of making a storm destroy itself. The crowd began to murmur, uncertain what they were watching. This wasn't the spectacle they'd paid for. It wasn't entertainment. It was something older, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous. The commentators struggled to fill the silence. "Jake Paul's aggression isn't landing," one said hesitantly. "It's like Norris is redirecting it somehow." His partner, a former fighter, leaned closer to the microphone. "That's not boxing anymore," he said softly. "That's philosophy in motion." Halfway through the round, Jake's punches slowed. His lungs burned, his arms felt heavy, and the silence between his movements grew longer. Every time he attacked, Chuck met him with an almost invisible gesture, a parry, a shift, a glance. Jake was no longer fighting a man, he was fighting his own exhaustion, and that terrified him. In a brief pause, he circled the ring, glaring. "You think you're teaching me something?" he spat. "This isn't a dojo, it's a fight." Chuck nodded once. "Exactly," Jake scowled. "Then fight me." "I am," Chuck said quietly. "Just not the way you want." The words hit harder than any punch. Jake swung again out of anger, and for the first time Chuck struck back. A single movement, a spinning back kick, delivered with perfect timing. It didn't connect fully, just brushed Jake's ribs, but the impact was enough to send a shock through his body. He stumbled back, clutching his side, eyes wide. The sound of the crowd roared to life again, but this time it wasn't laughter or excitement. It was awe. Jake's trainer shouted from the corner, "Keep your guard up, he's setting traps." But Jake wasn't listening. He stared at Chuck with something between anger and disbelief. The kick had been fast, too fast for a man his age. It wasn't just the speed that unnerved him. It was the precision, the control. Chuck had chosen not to finish him. He could have, and that realization cut deeper than pain. By the end of the round, Jake's confidence had fractured. His face was flushed, his chest heaving. The cameras caught it, the look of someone who had entered a fight expecting to dominate, only to find himself unraveling. When the bell rang, he stumbled back to his corner. His trainer leaned in, voice urgent. "You're letting him control the pace. You've got to change it up. Pressure him, keep him busy." Jake nodded automatically, but his eyes drifted to where Chuck sat in the opposite corner. The older man was still as stone, hands resting loosely on his knees, breathing slow. No sweat ran down his face, no twitch of fatigue. It was as if he were part of the ring itself. Jake's chest tightened. He told himself it was anger, but deep down, it was fear. When the fourth round began, Chuck didn't wait. He stepped forward, calm but assertive, and for the first time he led. Jake tried to reestablish control, jabbing, weaving, shouting to psych himself up. But Chuck's movements were too clean. He slipped under Jake's punches, countering not with power but with precision. A short jab to the chest, a low kick to disrupt balance, a sweep of the arm to redirect force. The rhythm was poetic, almost meditative. The crowd had fallen silent again. Even the commentators stopped speaking. All that could be heard was the slap of gloves, the shuffle of feet, and the deep rhythm of two men breathing. Then it happened, a turning point that no one could have scripted. Jake lunged with a hook, overextending his arm, and Chuck seized the moment. He pivoted, stepping inside the punch, and with a single fluid motion, he delivered a palm strike to Jake's solar plexus. The air left Jake's body in a violent gasp. He fell to one knee, clutching his stomach, struggling for breath. The referee moved forward instinctively, but Chuck raised a hand to stop him. "Let him stand," he said quietly. The referee hesitated, then stepped back. Jake coughed, gasping for air, eyes blazing with defiance. "You think that's it?" he rasped. "I'm not done." Chuck's expression didn't change. "Good," he said softly. "Then maybe you'll start listening." Jake forced himself up, fury returning like a shield. The crowd was chanting now, some for him, some for Chuck. The noise was chaotic, raw. Jake fed on it, using it to drown out the pain. He swung again, desperate, and landed a glancing blow on Chuck's shoulder. The crowd erupted, but Chuck barely flinched. He stepped back, nodded slightly, and said, "Better." For the first time, Jake hesitated. The word didn't sound condescending. It sounded genuine, like a teacher acknowledging a student. He didn't know how to process that. "Don't talk to me like that," he shouted, throwing another punch. Chuck deflected it effortlessly, then stopped fighting like a child. The exchange cut through Jake's defenses more effectively than any strike. His movements faltered. His anger, the engine of his fighting style, was sputtering. For the first time, he began to see the pattern, the rhythm of Chuck's stillness, the deliberate pace, the control that came not from force but from understanding. It infuriated him and fascinated him in equal measure. As the round drew to a close, Chuck delivered one final motion, a subtle sweep of his leg that caught Jake's ankle, sending him stumbling backward. Jake fell against the ropes, catching himself at the last second. The bell rang. The crowd was on its feet now, not roaring but buzzing with the strange electricity of revelation. They had come for a show, but they were witnessing something else entirely, a man being humbled in real time. Jake slumped in his corner, chest heaving. His trainer shouted instructions, but he barely heard them. His thoughts were a storm. Across the ring, Chuck sat motionless again, eyes closed, as if resting in meditation. The stillness unnerved Jake more than the hits. He couldn't understand how someone could be so calm in the middle of a fight. Aaron leaned toward Chuck. "He's unraveling," he said quietly. Chuck opened his eyes. "He's learning." The next round would decide more than a match. It would decide what Jake believed strength meant, and whether he was capable of letting go of the noise long enough to see what had been standing in front of him all along. The crowd could feel it too. The flashes slowed, the shouting dimmed. The storm of lights and fame that Jake had brought with him was starting to fade, replaced by something older and quieter. A lesson that couldn't be filmed, only felt. As the bell rang again, the two men met in the center of the ring. Jake raised his gloves, slower now but with purpose. Chuck mirrored him, and for the first time that night, there was no mockery, no noise, only respect, and the faint echo of something sacred beneath the roar of the crowd. The fifth round began with a sound that felt heavier than all the others before it. The bell didn't just mark the next 3 minutes of combat, it announced a moment that no one in the arena could predict, not even the men standing in the ring. The air carried a strange gravity, the kind that falls before storms or miracles. The crowd, so used to noise, seemed to sense it. Phones lowered, cheers softened into murmurs. Something was about to happen that wouldn't fit neatly into a highlight reel or a meme. Jake stood in his corner, sweat dripping from his jaw, his breathing labored and uneven. The physical exhaustion was obvious, but deeper than that was something else, something new, a crack in the certainty that had always carried him. He had fought dozens of opponents before, men faster, stronger, and angrier than this calm, aging martial artist in red. Yet none of them had made him feel this way. None had made him question himself while the fight was still happening. The silence that Chuck carried was beginning to infect him, spreading into the spaces between his thoughts, asking questions he didn't want to answer. Across the ring, Chuck Norris stood as though carved from the same material as the floor. His breathing was controlled, his gaze steady, his stance neither offensive nor defensive, but perfectly balanced between the two. Aaron watched from the corner, his hands folded, knowing the rhythm of his brother's body better than anyone alive. He could tell Chuck was measuring Jake not in anger, but in patience, as a teacher would measure the progress of a student who still resisted the lesson. The fight had long since stopped being about victory. It was about understanding. The referee looked from one fighter to the other, nodded, and signaled for the round to begin. Jake came out fast, determined to regain control. The sting of humiliation from the last round still burned inside him. He threw a sharp jab, then another, his movements crisp but tight with frustration. Chuck slipped the first, parried the second, and countered with a front kick that didn't hit hard, but stopped Jake in his tracks. The message was clear. Slow down. Think. Jake ignored it. He attacked again, combinations flowing one into the next hook, uppercut, body shot, but his timing was breaking apart. Each punch missed by inches, Chuck's body turning and shifting with almost supernatural precision. It was as though he could see not just where Jake was, but where he was about to be. Every move Jake made felt predicted before it happened, and that terrified him. "Stand still," Jake barked, his voice echoing through the ring. "Stop dodging." Chuck didn't answer. He simply pivoted, sidestepping another wild hook, and let Jake's momentum carry him forward into empty air. When Jake turned off balance, Chuck's right hand shot out a lightning-quick strike to the shoulder that sent a shock through Jake's arm. It wasn't enough to injure, but enough to make him hesitate. The commentators' voices wavered, uncertain how to frame what they were seeing. "Norris isn't fighting like a boxer," one said. "He's doing something else, something older." The other replied softly, "It's not about the punches, it's about control. Look at him. He's dictating every second without saying a word." The crowd had gone eerily quiet again. not out of boredom, but awe. They were watching something they didn't fully understand, a kind of combat that wasn't about destruction, but mastery. Jake circled, panting heavily. The crowd's silence unnerved him more than their cheers ever had. It was as though they were waiting for him to realize something he couldn't yet see. He charged forward again, anger replacing strategy, but Chuck met him mid-attack with a counter he'd been saving all fight. A spinning heel kick, clean and precise, landed squarely against Jake's ribs. The sound cracked through the air like a gunshot. Jake staggered back, his body folding instinctively around the pain. He tried to recover, but his legs betrayed him, wobbling under the weight of the blow. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Chuck stood in front of him, hands still raised but not advancing. His eyes were calm, not triumphant, not cruel, just calm. Jake gasped for breath, clutching his side, sweat and pain blurring his vision. You're holding back, he muttered, disbelief and anger mixing in his voice. Chuck's reply was simple. Yes. Jake's head snapped up. Why? Because the lesson's not over yet. The words hit harder than the kick. Jake's fury reignited. Don't talk to me like that. You think you can teach me something? You think I don't know what it means to fight? He threw himself forward again, wild and reckless, landing a glancing blow on Chuck's jaw, his first real connection of the night. The crowd gasped. For a heartbeat, Jake felt the rush of dominance again, the validation of power. But then Chuck turned back toward him, unfazed. The expression on his face didn't change. There was no anger, no pain, only an almost paternal stillness. You fight to be seen, Chuck said quietly, but you've forgotten to see. Jake's next swing faltered. What? He barked, his tone defensive, confused. Chuck stepped closer, closing the distance between them, speaking so quietly that only Jake could hear. You think strength is noise. You think respect is fear. You think silence is weakness. That's why you keep missing. Jake froze. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his gloves trembling in front of him. For the first time in his career, his opponent's words had cut through the adrenaline. He couldn't respond. He wanted to say something clever, to turn it into a soundbite, but nothing came. The cameras, the crowd, the lights, all of it faded to a distant hum. In that moment, it was just him and the man who refused to fight on his terms. Chuck stepped back, assuming his stance again. Now, he said softly, let's finish this. The bell sounded again, marking the final round. Both men stood in the center of the ring. Jake's movements were slower now, his punches more measured, his fury tempered by something he didn't yet understand, but could feel growing inside him. The crowd, sensing the gravity of what was unfolding, had stopped cheering altogether. They were witnessing a transformation, one man fighting for glory, and another guiding him towards something far greater. Jake advanced carefully this time. His punches were still powerful, but there was rhythm now, intent. Chuck blocked and countered, but his strikes had softened, carrying the tone of instruction rather than punishment. Each exchange became a conversation without words, a dialogue between experience and ambition. Then came the moment everyone would remember. Jake launched a desperate right hook, his last burst of energy, and Chuck met it perfectly. He pivoted on his heel and delivered a spinning back kick straight to Jake's chest. The impact reverberated through the arena. Jake's feet left the ground as the air left his lungs, and he crashed to the mat with a sound that silenced 20,000 people at once. For a second, there was no movement. The referee hesitated, uncertain whether to start the count. Then Chuck raised a hand, signaling him to wait. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Chuck knelt beside his fallen opponent. Jake lay on his back, chest heaving, his mind spinning with fragments of thought and pain. He looked up at Chuck, expecting gloating, a smirk, a quip for the cameras. But Chuck's face was calm, compassionate. He extended his hand. "Get up," he said softly. "You're not finished." Jake blinked, the world swimming in light and confusion. Slowly, he reached out and grasped the hand. Chuck pulled him to his feet, steadying him when his knees threatened to buckle. The referee looked between them, unsure what to do, but the two men ignored him. Jake stood there, still dazed, and whispered hoarsely, "Why didn't you end it? You had me." Chuck's eyes softened. Because it was never about ending you. It was about waking you up. The words hung in the air, carried through the silence like the echo of something sacred. The referee finally called the fight. Officially, it was a stoppage, Jake Paul unable to continue. But no one in the arena heard that part. What they saw was Jake standing beside the man who had just humbled him, bowing his head not out of defeat but respect. Chuck bowed in return, the gesture slow and deliberate. The crowd, unsure how to react, began to clap. It started as a ripple, then grew into a wave that filled the entire stadium. Back in their respective corners, trainers and crews moved forward, but the two men remained still, sharing a brief silence that belonged to no one else. Jake finally spoke, his voice raw. "You knew what would happen the moment you stepped in here, didn't you?" Chuck nodded. "I knew what needed to happen." Jake swallowed hard, his pride still wounded, but his heart shifting. "And you still did it?" Chuck smiled faintly. "Of course, because sometimes people learn only when they're seen failing." Later in the locker room, the reporters waited for the quotes they could turn into headlines, for the sound bites they could package for the morning shows. Jake sat on the bench, staring at the floor, his ribs wrapped, his face bruised but his eyes clearer than they had been in years. When a reporter asked if he felt humiliated, he shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "I feel awake." In another room, Chuck sat in silence, his hands resting on his knees. Aaron stood nearby, watching him. "You did it," he said softly. Chuck shook his head. "No, he did." The next morning, the world exploded with reactions, memes, debates, analysis. Some called it a humiliation, others a masterclass. But beneath the noise, a quieter narrative began to form. People talked about what they'd felt watching it, about the strange calm that had taken over the arena, about the moment when victory had turned into grace. Even Jake's own followers began to post differently, not mocking, but thoughtful. For a brief moment, the internet stopped shouting and started listening. A week later, Jake showed up at Chuck's Texas ranch, unannounced. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sand. Chuck was outside, chopping wood. Jake approached slowly, still sore, but standing tall. "I wanted to see you," he said. Chuck set down the axe, wiping his hands. "You found me," he said. "Now what?" Jake hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I think I'm ready to learn." Chuck studied him for a long moment, then nodded toward the open yard. "Then start by sweeping the mat," he said. Jake laughed softly, unsure if it was a joke. "That's it?" "That's always it," Chuck replied. "Discipline begins with the smallest things." And as the sky turned red over the Texas horizon, the sound of sweeping filled the quiet air, a rhythm as old as the art itself. The teacher returned to his silence, and the student began again, this time not for fame, not for followers, but for truth. The lesson that began under the blinding lights of Las Vegas would continue here, in the desert, where silence had always been the loudest voice. Don't stop here. Hit subscribe and keep watching the next stories. Share this video so more people see what really happened.